Folks. In this week's video, I want to talk a little bit, actually a lot, about SAML. Um, now, I know from experience that SAML is not exactly everybody's favorite topic in the world. Um, so I'm going to try to knock it out in one video. This video will be kind of long, but there's good reason for that. And it starts off with an announcement. Um, Officially, Cortex supports Okta and what's the other one? Um, Azure AD or Entra ID, whatever they're calling it now. Okta and Azure AD, in addition to ADFS. Cortex has supported these kind of unofficially over the course of the last several months, but as I've been helping people set Cortex up with actually both of those technologies, I've realized that Cortex has everything that it needs to in order for them to be officially supported. So there's no code change involved. In fact, these were supported unofficially back as far as 1.4. So all of the released, possibly even 1.3. So all of the stable versions of Cortex that are supported support all of these authentication mechanisms. So that's Okta, that's Azure AD, that's ADFS, and um, OpenID Connect, specifically with Keycloak, but we can make it work with other OpenID Connect providers. That's kind of the premise of OpenID Connect. So anyway, in today's video, I want to walk you through everything that I can think of having to do with SAML and how it works with Cortex. I'm also going to show a little bit of new documentation. We've added some stuff to the documentation site. I'm trying to keep that as up to date as possible, and basically every time I have a conversation with someone who asks a question, and I realize that either there isn't a good answer published on the internet, or this is something that's going to keep coming up again and again. I turn it into not so much a knowledge article, not a KB, but another page on the documentation. I'm trying to make all of this stuff findable, so that as you're setting up Cortex, as you're evaluating Cortex, wherever you are along your journey, you can find the information that you need. You can find the answers that you're looking for. And it also helps me in conversation as well. Even if I'm going to be looking over your shoulder or on a screen share, helping you through setting up some part of Cortex, it helps for me to be able to reference something and send it to you so that we're both literally looking at the same page. And that kind of gives us some common ground so that, you can fill in the troubleshooting piece, I can fill in some of the color, but at least we both have some structure that's just the facts and none of the commentary. So I'll show that. Before we get into that, I do want to remind you all that every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time, I run the Cortex Users Group. That's an hour that I set aside for all of you to join if you have time, if you're able. You don't have to come every week. You don't have to come at all. But it's a great time for you to ask me questions about Cortex, ask your peers about Cortex. You might ask them how their experience setting up Cortex with Okta was, for instance. I can say it's fine. It works just fine, because I've done it multiple times. I feel like I'm a little bit too expert on some of these things. I never intended to be an expert on authentication and authentication mechanisms, but it just kind of worked out that way. So, it might come a lot easier to me than it does to all of you, and it might be good to ask, for other people's opinions, and would they rather do ADFS versus Okta? I don't know. That I definitely can answer because I don't really run either of those things in production. So it's a good opportunity to just have a conversation. It's super casual. I'm not trying to sell you anything in those calls. Of course, I do hope that you do go with Cortex, but those calls are not about selling anything. Though I may show features that I'm working on, things that I'm thinking of exploring, maybe adding to Cortex, maybe adding in the future. Obviously Cortex um, solves a very specific problem, and eventually that problem is just going to be solved. Um, but I don't want to stop there. I want to keep going. So that's where I talk to people about some of the things I'm thinking of doing next. And if you want to be a part of those conversations, come to the Cortex users group. There's a link down below to request an invite to that. There's also links down below to a bunch of other stuff. The documentation site that I'll show today. There's a demo site to Cortex, which I'm actually not going to show today. This is all the demos for today don't actually involve the demo site. But there's a link down there for that. And links to schedule time on my calendar to talk about how we can get Cortex working on your data, or if you have specific questions that you don't want to ask in the context of the group, schedule some time with me and we can talk about that in a smaller setting. So with that, let's dive into some documentation. All right. So here's the documentation site. Again, link down in the video description. And pretty much everything is behind Get Started. So if you click Get Started, you get this navigation here, which used to have, well, as of last week, it had like 5 or 6 items. And now it has quite a few. I've added logging, updating Cortex, and a bunch of stuff under authentication. We'll get to the authentication in just a minute, but let's start with talking about a little bit about logging and upgrading Cortex. So logging, Cortex obviously does log some things, and most of what it logs is warnings and errors, those sorts of things. These are useful, for instance, when Cortex encounters a piece of configuration that's specific to your system that I just haven't encountered before. So, as I've been building Cortex, I'm building, based on what I've seen before, based on what I've seen people have configured their systems to leverage as far as what Cherwell features are there. Because I didn't want to try to enumerate everything you could possibly do with Cherwell, and I'd have a 3-year backlog of things to do, and we just never get anywhere. Cortex would never be usable. So that's not the approach I took. I took the approach of, well, starting with the demo czar. That's why the demo site uses the Cherwell demo database. What are the things that the Cherwell demo database uses? Make sure I can support those. And then I started running on your databases, customer databases. Some of them based on older demo databases or older Cherwell starter databases, whatever, using different patterns, different configurations that I needed to adapt to. And of course, Cortex didn't support them initially, so I added them. And this quick iteration, and I'm talking like a lot of times it's within the same week. I get a report of a particular piece of configuration that Cortex dies on, and I have a fix that evening, and it's published the next day. That's what I'm trying to do. I want it to this iteration to be as quick as possible, because I want you to be able to use Cortex as quickly as possible. And I do fully expect that with every new database, there's going to be something that I wasn't expecting. It might not cause Cortex to stop working altogether. That's my hope. I'm doing everything I can to prevent that from happening. Occasionally, it still happens just because I can't account for everything. I can't expect the unexpected, right? But in some cases, things might just not look right. I still work on those too. So there are a few things I can think of off the top of my head that I've got a list over the next couple of days. I've got a few things to knock out, and that'll be in there in the next release. The way I find out about these things are obviously reports from you, but the information that I need are things from the logs. I do log some of the things, some of the values that around the situations that cause these crashes. And nine times out of 10, I'm able to pinpoint exactly what's happening based just on the logging. So if you run into an issue, step one, absolutely, go look at the logs. And depending on how you're running Cortex, where those logs live might be slightly different, but that's what this page is for. It tells you, based on the way you're running Cortex, where to find those logs, what you'll find in the logs, and then you can just email them to me. There's nothing fancy about how to get those to me. So let's say you ran into an issue, you reported a bug, and I said it's fixed in whatever version. Well, now it's time to upgrade Cortex. Again, depending on how you're running Cortex, uh, there might be a slightly different way of updating Cortex. But basically, it boils down to one of two options. Um, if you're using Docker, you change the tag of the image that you're using for the Docker image, or other container runtime. Most of you are not using a container runtime. You're running Cortex in IIS. That's actually the recommended way to do things, is to run it through IIS, primarily because it's kind of a one-to-one mirror for how Cherwell was running. Um, and in that case, it's just files on disk. So back up your configuration. Well, first stop IIS, back up your configuration, which it mentions on this page, the app settings JSON and the web config file. Delete all the files from the old version of Cortex, drop in the files from the new version of Cortex, restore your configuration files, start IIS. Pretty simple. There's no installer, but that's because Cortex isn't that complicated of an application. Um, and again, like with installing it for the first time, if you want help, if you need help, if you just want someone to watch over your shoulder and make sure you're clicking the right buttons, let us know. It'll take like 10 minutes. So pretty quick, pretty easy. But that's how you get the new versions of Cortex. All right. So now let's talk about authentication. So again, we now have multiple ways to use SAML, officially supported ways to use SAML. Now you might notice there's one option that is missing from this list that is supported by Cherwell, and that's Shibboleth. Eventually, I do want to add Shibboleth. I just haven't tested it with Shibboleth. If you're using Shibboleth and you want to be my guinea pig, hit me up. Again, link down in the description to book time on my calendar, and we can make sure it works. I'm sure it does. I just haven't done it, so I'm not going to write a page on the documentation site with steps and say yes, it is officially supported, but unofficially, it's probably supported. Um, Another potential option is something like Keycloak. I really like Keycloak. It's what I use internally. Um, I use it mostly with OpenID Connect, though I have played around with using it for SAML. Haven't done SAML in Keycloak with Cortex yet. That's not true. That's how I built the SAML integration. Um, that and ADFS. So I just need to document that. But I don't think anyone's using Keycloak for SAML. Um, if that's wrong, if you're using Keycloak for SAML, let me know. I'll write up a page for it. Again, I know it works because I used it for development, um, and we can get it going. So anyway, options for authentication. No authentication. Big neon sign. Don't use this for production. This is just for trying it out. Especially if you're running on the demo database, or if you want to download Cortex, run it on your local machine connected to a production database. Okay, that's fine. But if you're going to have Cortex publicly available, or accessible to anything outside of your local machine, do not use the no authentication option, except maybe just to verify that everything else is working. Um, as soon as you verify that you're connected to your database and that the Cortex application is running, it's time to secure it with real authentication. OpenID Connect, again, there's only one option that's officially supported, but SAML, we now have ADFS, which I have a video on from a while back. I'll leave that link down in the video description. And now we have Okta and Azure AD. So real quick with the rest of the video, and I know it's getting long already, but the rest of the video, we're going to do a quick walkthrough of how SAML works generally. And then I'll show the Okta configuration and the Azure AD configuration in that order. So let's start with a quick walkthrough of SAML. So this is the Wikipedia page. If you're looking for technical details of SAML, there are other great resources that I think are, well, there's one. There are a few others linked, I think, from this page, probably down in references. Sorry if I'm making anyone sick. Somewhere down here, yeah, there's a bunch of stuff. Auth0 has a good write up of how SAML works. But Wikipedia is good enough for our purposes here, just to give the general overview. So it does mean security assertion markup language. It is an XML-based protocol, and you get some ugly XML. If you've done anything with SAML, you've probably come across this XML at one point or another. It's ugly. You don't want to read it by yourself. But it serves its purpose. Again, we're not going to get into the nitty gritty. What we are going to look at is this diagram. Basically, the general overview of the pieces that go into play with when you're setting up SAML. There are two main server components, and then of course there's the user's browser, right? And on the left side, we have something called the service provider, commonly abbreviated SP. That's in our case, that's Cortex, or with Cherwell, that was Cherwell. That's the application that provides the service, that does the thing you're trying to do. And then on the right side, we have the identity provider. This is commonly abbreviated IDP, and the I is capital, the D is lowercase, and then the P is capital. So if you see IDP, that's referring to the identity provider. This is what does the authentication. So both SAML and OpenID Connect serve to solve the problem of a service provider wants to be able to know who is using it, but doesn't want to deal with usernames, passwords, that sort of thing. Additionally, whoever manages users for an organization might want to enforce particular safeguards on those authentication tokens, right? This is why single sign-on in general exists. It's so that you can all authenticate through your directory, be it Active Directory or Google or Okta, your single sign-on provider. It's all managed centrally. You can enforce multi-factor authentication, across all users, across all platforms, and it doesn't have to be managed per application, right? So basically, the service provider does the service, and it does that specific role, and the identity provider serves the identity provider role, and it focuses on that. So you have this separation of concerns. The biggest thing that SAML brings to the table is trust. And a lot of the technical details of how SAML is built is specifically to ensure that the service provider can trust these assertions. A more modern term is claim, basically a statement about the user that is using a system, can trust that comes from an authoritative source, i.e. the identity provider. So let's go through kind of the steps that happen when you go to the service provider and you're not logged in. And that's typically how this is used. There is something called IDP-initiated SAML, which Cherwell did support. And this is used. That's essentially the case of if you have like a dashboard of a bunch of different applications that you have to be authenticated to see this dashboard, you can click a button or an icon or something and go directly to that application and you're automatically logged in. That's IDP initiated. Typically, we're used to going to the service first. We go to google.com and then we're prompted to log in. Google doesn't use SAML, but the metaphor holds. Okay, so anyway, in our case, the service provider is Cortex. And let's just pretend for sake of argument right now that the identity provider is Okta, since that's the example we're going to look at next. So the process goes something like this. And I am going to use the numbers on this particular diagram. So number one, the user requests the target resource. They request to see the application, right? So, type in URL to browser, hit enter, or click a bookmark, a favorite, whatever. And something happens behind the scenes. The service provider says, oh, I don't know who you are, but I do know how to log you in. I'm going to use SAML. And what it does is issues, I'm going to lump 2 and 3 together. It redirects to the identity provider using the browser. So this isn't a server to server communication. This is using the browser. The service provider says, hey, browser, redirect the user to this other location. Typically, this is done through a post request. Doesn't have to be, but it's recommended to be. That's the way Cherwell does it, and that's the way Cortex does it. And basically, it includes a giant XML document, one of these ugly things that was further up on the page. And that can optionally be signed, encrypted, as long as the identity provider knows how to validate that signature or that encryption or decrypt the encryption. So as we'll see, Okta and Azure AD do not do that. ADFS does do that. And the way that Cherwell was set up, that was expected. I think what happened was we as a community realized that that wasn't really necessary. I mean, yes, you can do that if you're really concerned about a service provider actually being the application that it says it is and not an imposter. But realistically, it's already checking the URL anyway, and it does check the URL. And that's good enough for most scenarios. Okay, so 2 and 3 have happened. Now that dotted line that's not labeled in between 3 and 4, that's the actual logging in. So this is the user typing their username and password to a page on the identity provider's web application. There might be multiple HTTP requests going back and forth at that point, but at some point, the user is finally logged into the identity provider, and the identity provider has enough information to create the SAML assertions. And truly, what is usually referred to when you're talking about SAML assertions are these claims about the user. So step 4, respond with an XHTML form. Little bit of technical information. A GET request, you can't send a whole lot of information. So you have to send a post, or in this case, it's a form, which defaults a post, in order to send this giant XML that contains all the information about the user. So in step 4, the identity provider renders a form to the browser saying, here's all the information about the user. And typically it automatically posts the form and the target of the form, where it's actually going to post to, is a very specific URL on the service provider. And that's step 5. So when this form posts, it sends a post request with the security assertions to what is referred to as the assertion consumer service. It's just a URL on the service provider web application. And at that point, the service provider can start processing these claims. Typically, what's involved in that is decoding the XML, kind of extracting the information about the XML. If the assertions are signed, which they should be, or encrypted, which they can be, technically you really you don't need either of those. You don't need either of those. You should have one of those. Sometimes people do both. Cherwell required at least one, and Cortex will kind of roll with it. It'll do whatever the IDP says it's going to do based on the initial metadata. So that dotted line between steps 1 and 2. But you should either sign or encrypt the assertions. And by default, Okta and Azure AD both do this. The instructions for setting up SAML with both of those providers don't recommend changing any of the defaults. So the defaults, I think both of them default to just signing the assertions. And that's sufficient because basically it allows the service provider to verify that the true identity provider is what actually provided those assertions at that point in time, and with the valid certificate and a bunch of other good stuff. And then from that point on, 6, 7, 8 is just using the application normally. So once you've validated the user, you can set whatever state, or the service provider sets whatever state is necessary, establishes a session, if you want to think of it that way, and then redirects you to like the home page or your profile page or whatever, dashboard, that sort of thing. Okay. I think we've had enough of the general overview of SAML. So let's go into how to set up SAML with Okta. And I've been signed out. That's fantastic. So I'm going to, and I've been signed back in. That's great. Okay. So on my dashboard here, it's actually not the dashboard. It's under applications. And this is an Okta developer account. I assume it's similar for an actual production account. Just you probably don't have the banner that says anything about Developer Edition. You can see I've played around with an app called Cortex. I also built one for OIDC, and it looks like my cat added one. That's the only thing I can think of. N, M, comma. They're all right next to each other. So apparently my cats wanted to log in with SAML. So I'm not sure how I feel about that. But anyway, how do we create a new SAML integration so that Cortex can use our Okta? We start with Create App Integration. We choose SAML. And then we've got this wizard, which asks for 3 steps. App name, you can do Cortex, or I'm going to just do Cortex Demo, just so it's a different name. App logo, if you want to add a logo, you can. I don't have a logo for Cortex, so I'm not going to add one. And these choices are up to you. Whatever makes sense for your organization, how you use Okta, one or both of these checkboxes might make sense. We'll hit next. All right, single sign-on URL. Okta actually puts these boxes in the reverse order that I would typically expect them to see. But this URL is, it was described as the assertion consumer service URL. You can see that in the tooltip there. And for Cortex, this is, I'm going to put a placeholder here for a second, Cortex URL / SAML - assertion, spelled properly, I believe. So I'm just going to set this up. I'm going to pretend that I'm running this on my local machine on the standard port of, standard HTTPS port of 443. So we'll just do HTTPS : // localhost SAML assertion. Now this next URL, the audience URI, is, remember how I mentioned that you could, in that initial SAML request, the redirect from the service provider to the identity provider, you could sign that request, but it wasn't necessary because the IDP verified that the request came from a known URL. This is that known URL. So this URL absolutely, well, they both have to be the URL that you're going to access Cortex on, but that first one has to be the URL you're going to use to access Cortex / SAML assertion. That also means that if you're using IIS and you have Cortex in a subdirectory or a virtual directory or virtual application, and you would type in localhost / Cortex, that URL has to be localhost / Cortex / SAML assertion. Down here, it should be whatever you typed up here minus the SAML assertion part. So I'm just going to copy that, paste it. You can leave this blank, this one set to email address, and everything else you can leave the defaults, unless you know that they should be different. But 9 times out of 10, they should just stay the defaults. If you want to see some ugly XML, you can click that button. I won't scare you on this video. We'll hit next. And here, this is just a bunch of questions that are very specifically optional. They're not required to set up the integration, but Okta wants to know how people are using their platform. So if you want to drop the link to the documentation or even this video into one of these boxes, you're more than welcome to let Okta know how you learned how to set this stuff up. So I'm going to click finish, and we'll see that we have now created that integration. Now, we need to do 2 things on this page. The first one is copy this metadata URL. That'll be used in the configuration file. If you're using the app settings.json file, there's a specific key that you drop that into. If you're using environment variables because you're using, say, Docker, there's a specific environment variable that you need to set. But you need this URL, and there's this convenient copy button here. And then assignments, you probably want to allow some people to use the app. So for instance, I could just assign everybody, sure, yeah, save and go back, assign, yeah, sure, that works. And now everybody in my domain can use the application because I only have 2 users. All right, so that's Okta. Now, let's talk about Azure AD. And maybe I'm still logged in over here. I am. Okay, on Azure AD, this is actually like a full Azure account. This is my actual Azure account. But if you're just using Azure AD, you have access to this screen. If you're using full Azure, you also have access to this screen. This is enterprise applications. You can search up here for enterprise applications and it'll show up. We're just going to hit new application and click create your own application because Cortex is not in the Microsoft Entra gallery, whatever this is. All right, create a new application, Cortex, and it doesn't find it, of course. And this bottom option here, integrate any other application you don't find in the gallery, is the correct thing to click. And we'll wait while that creates. In the meantime, we'll go back to the documentation. And basically, we're going through this top section here. With ADFS, you do a bunch of configuration in Cortex first, and then go to ADFS and do that configuration. For Okta and Azure AD, it's the other way around. You go to, in this case, Azure AD first and make some changes. And see, here's the your Cortex URL / SAML assertion that I was talking about before. And then you grab some information from Azure AD to use down here, copied from step 3 in the last section. So we're just going to walk through these 2 additional steps. We just did step 1 and now we're waiting. We're going to do these other 2 steps, and that's going to be it for the demo. All right, so we've got some stuff. We're going to go over here to set up single sign-on. Brings us down to this tab down here. I'm going to say SAML because that's what we're setting up. And you'll notice that there are a few things that are specifically required and then a bunch of optional stuff. And it basically corresponds to the same stuff that Okta was asking about, right? All right, so let's edit this information. So let's see. Identifier. We know what this is. This is going to be https://your Cortex URL with no /SAML assertion because, like I said, I mentioned on Okta, I thought those first 2 fields should be the other way around. They are the way I expect to see them on Azure AD. So it's the entity ID first and then the assertion consumer service URL second. Okta had them the other way around with the ACS URL first and the entity ID second. Why it's called the entity ID, I don't know. These are terms that SAML uses. Why not just call it the app URL and the, I don't know, sign-on URL? I don't know. SAML decided to invent a bunch of terms. So anyway, https:// how you're going to actually get to Cortex. The URL you're going to type into the browser goes into entity ID. And add reply URL, it's going to be the same thing with SAML-assertion afterward. And that SAML-assertion doesn't matter what system you're using, that's a Cortex URL. So no matter what you put in entity ID, you're always going to put /SAML assertion when you copy and paste that to the reply URL, assertion consumer service URL, whatever that URL is called. Here it's called reply URL. All right, and we'll save that. And in just a second, this should refresh. And there we go, it shows up. Okay, obviously, I hope this was obvious. Don't put your -cortex -URL there. Actually put your Cortex URL. Don't want to test later. Okay, everything else should be good. 9 times out of 10. And then at this point, you will want to copy this app federation metadata URL. Copy to clipboard. And that's what you use as the IDP metadata URL in the Cortex configuration. And at this point, we're done in Azure AD. All the rest of the configuration is in Cortex. So if we go back to the documentation, that's what we just did. Copy the app federation metadata URL. From that point on, it's configured in Cortex, update your authentication type to use SAML, set a few properties. Both Azure AD and Okta use self-signed certificates for the certificates that are used to sign the assertions in the authentication response. This is okay because the certificates are not being used to judge authenticity of the IDP. The fact that you're talking to the IDP and the fact that it presents an SSL certificate are deemed sufficient for proving the IDP's identity. The fact that you continue to use the IDP is proof that it's valid. So this certificate is solely used for its cryptographic properties, its ability to sign data, and its ability to encrypt and decrypt data. So if you want a whole lecture on the value of certificates and why we use certificates and the multiple different use cases of certificates and why I'm making such a distinction between how this is using a certificate and how certificates could be used other ways, I'd be happy to talk to you about that in a completely different video or just one-on-one. Yeah, so anyway, it's just using the certificate to sign the data. That's the only reason it's using the certificate. Both pages, and actually in a few places on the documentation site, I talk about additional options that you might need and specifically how you might determine that you might need some of those additional options, which brings you to the login page. And we've come full circle. So 40 minutes later, we've talked about everything there is to know about SAML, probably more than you ever wanted to know about SAML, how to set up SAML for Cortex using Okta and Azure AD. And again, there's another video for how to set up ADFS with Cortex. And in that video, I do go through all of the steps. I actually show the Cortex configuration file. It is specifically for ADFS, but they're all the same settings, essentially the same settings. You don't have to set as many for Okta and for Azure AD, but they're all named the same things. They're all the same settings. So check out that video if you're doing ADFS, or if you want a little walkthrough on how to actually set the values in the app settings.json. Again, if you want someone to look over your shoulder or have additional questions, there's a link down in the description below to schedule some time on my calendar. I'm happy to sit with you and make sure you're clicking the right buttons. Happy to explain more about this to you. I want to see you succeed in setting up Cortex because, obviously it is a little bit tricky because you have to set it up in your own environment. So I'm certainly available to help. If you're working with a partner, our partners are great. Our partners are knowledgeable about this sort of thing, as well as the Cherwell side and whatever ITSM system you're going to. They're familiar with how to set up Cortex with any one of these platforms because they've done it a couple times, at least a couple times themselves. So they're a resource as well. Again, every Tuesday, 10 a.m. Pacific, the Cortex users group. If you have questions about authentication, you can ask them there as well. And myself and other people will have stories and information to share with you. I've gone on it long enough. This is the longest video I've done in a long time. So I'll let you all go. Thanks for watching. If you stuck around to the end, that's amazing. If you watched bits and pieces and just picked up the pieces that you needed, more power to you. If you're not subscribed to the channel, hit subscribe. I probably won't do any videos quite this long ever again, maybe, but possibly there might be some longer ones mixed in with some shorter ones. I've got a few coming specifically on some new features. I know there's at least one feature that I've promised for Cortex 1.5 that I haven't done a video on yet, which is a good segue into Cortex 1.5 dropping soon. It's not quite ready, but I'm aiming to get it out by the end of August. I know that gives me a few weeks. Hopefully it'll be before then. There are still a few things that I want to get in to Cortex 1.5. If they don't turn out quite the way that I want them to be, I'll still ship Cortex 1.5, just with a couple corners cut. And then we'll get those next features in 1.6 for sure. But yeah, stay tuned for those videos coming soon. If you have any questions, shoot me an email, schedule time with me, drop a comment down below, and maybe I'll do a video on that. Maybe I'll do a shorter video next week. We'll see. Thank you for watching. I will see you next week.